The Assyrian Empire was history's first true superpower. Its military might is legendary, but beneath that strength lay a legacy of calculated brutality. The secret to their centuries of control was a chilling system of state-sponsored terror. Over the next 30 revelations, we will uncover the darkest aspects of their rule, from psychological warfare to organized cruelty. By the end, you will understand the machinery that kept an empire in power through fear alone. Do you think any empire built on fear can truly survive? The Assyrians did not hide their cruelty, they advertised it. In the grand palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud, stone reliefs lined the walls with scenes of what happened to those who resisted. Kings also commissioned annals, long-written records carved into clay or stone that listed their victories in meticulous detail. These were not simple boasts. They were deliberate messages to every corner of the empire and beyond. The message was clear: defy Assyria, and you will not simply be defeated. You will be removed from life in a way designed to be remembered. Historians describe this as the systematic use of terror as state policy. The Assyrian kings understood a basic truth of ancient warfare. A reputation for extreme treatment could sometimes win a battle before a single soldier marched. When a region heard rumors of impalements and public ceremonies of punishment, the will to resist often collapsed. This saved the empire time, resources, and lives of their own troops. So the horrors depicted in reliefs were not random outbursts of rage. They were carefully chosen tools of governance, calculated to produce maximum psychological effect. For example, cities that surrendered willingly were often treated with surprising leniency. They paid tribute and kept their local leaders, but cities that fought back received a very different fate. The annals of kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Sennacherib describe entire populations being relocated or subjected to harsh treatment. The goal was to create a stark contrast. Cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant the kind of story that would be told for generations, a story no parent wanted for their children. This approach was not unique to a single ruler. It became a tradition passed down from king to king. Each new monarch sought to outdo his predecessors in the scale of the warning they sent. The result was an empire where fear was as much a part of the infrastructure as roads and garrisons. Caravans traveled safely because bandits knew the cost of being caught. Satraps collected taxes promptly because they knew the consequences of failure. The entire system was held together not by loyalty, but by a shared understanding of what happened to those who stepped out of line. Yet this reliance on terror contained a hidden weakness. Fear can control behavior, but it cannot inspire loyalty. And when the empire began to weaken, there was no deep well of goodwill to draw upon. The very policy that had held things together for centuries would eventually contribute to its collapse. The question is not whether such a system was effective, but how long any system built on such a foundation could last. One of the most effective tools in the Assyrian arsenal was not a weapon but a policy of mass relocation. Entire populations were uprooted from their homelands and marched hundreds of miles to distant corners of the empire. The goal was straightforward: break the spirit of resistance by cutting people off from everything they knew. Their ancestral lands, their temples, their graves of their parents, all left behind. In their place, the empire planted foreign settlers who had no connection to the region and no reason to rebel. This practice, known as forced deportation, was applied on an astonishing scale. The Assyrian king Sargon II claimed to have deported over 27,000 people from Samaria after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. These are the people history remembers as the 10 lost tribes. They were not lost in the sense of wandering aimlessly. They were deliberately scattered across the empire, mixed with other populations, and absorbed into a new identity. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations at sites in modern-day Iraq and Syria have revealed settlement patterns that show sudden changes in population. Distinctive pottery styles, burial practices, and building techniques from the Israelite region appear in areas far from their origin. These were not voluntary migrations. The journey itself was a trial. Families walked for weeks or months, often in chains, with limited food and water. Many did not survive the road. Those who arrived were assigned to agricultural estates, construction projects, or new towns where they were a minority among strangers. The psychological devastation was immense. Imagine being told you must leave the village where your ancestors had lived for centuries, the fields your family had tended, the hills where you played as a child. You take only what you can carry, you watch your home burn behind you, and when you finally stop, you are surrounded by unfamiliar languages and customs. Your old songs are forbidden. Your religious festivals have no place. Over time, your children begin to speak the new tongue, and the stories of the old land fade into legend. This was exactly the intention. The Assyrians understood that a people without a homeland is a people without a will to fight. By diluting national identities, they prevented the formation of large, unified resistance movements. It was a strategy of cultural dissolution executed with bureaucratic precision. Yet even this massive uprooting left traces. Modern historians and geneticists have studied the patterns of ancient resettlement, finding echoes in the DNA and traditions of communities across the Middle East. The legacy of those deportations is not just a story of loss. It is a story of how identity can survive even when everything else is taken away. For those who led the resistance, the consequences were even more public and deeply personal. The Assyrian kings recorded in their royal annals the precise fates of captured enemy rulers, and these accounts were not hidden away. They were carved into stone and placed in prominent locations, meant to be read by visitors, ambassadors, and future generations. The message was direct: no king was above the empire's reach. The treatment of a defeated leader was a performance staged for maximum effect. One of the most frequently mentioned practices involved the display of the ruler's head at the city gate. After a battle, the Assyrian army would bring the severed head back to the nearest conquered town and hang it in a prominent spot. This was not a moment of simple brutality. It was a deliberate signal that all resistance had ended. Anyone entering or leaving that city would see the remains of their former ruler. The visual reminder served to crush any lingering hope of rebellion. In some cases, the head was then sent on a tour of other rebellious regions, carried by messengers as proof that the Assyrian army could reach anyone. The annals of Ashurnasirpal II describe one particular campaign where a rebel leader was captured alive. According to the inscription, the king ordered a public ceremony. The rebel was brought before the assembled population. Then, as the account records, a specific process was carried out that resulted in the removal of the leader's skin. This skin was later displayed on the city wall, a lasting monument to the cost of defiance. Historians note that such descriptions served a dual purpose. First, they satisfied a cultural expectation of royal power. A king was expected to demonstrate his control over enemies. Second, they functioned as a deterrent for future generations. When a scribe wrote these words, he was not merely recording history. He was crafting a warning that would echo for centuries. The Assyrian treatment of enemy leaders also included public humiliation. Captured kings were often paraded through the streets of Nineveh, their hands tied, their royal garments stripped away. They were forced to walk in front of the Assyrian king's chariot while crowds watched. This reversal of fortune was a deliberate symbolic act. The ruler who once commanded armies and sat on a throne was now reduced to a spectacle. In the Assyrian worldview, this was proof that their own gods were superior. The Assyrian king was not just a military victor, he was the instrument of divine will, and the defeated leader was an example of what happened to those who opposed the gods. This religious framing made the treatment feel justified to the Assyrian people. It was not cruelty for its own sake, it was cosmic justice displayed for all to see. Yet even this extreme public punishment had a strategic limit. The Assyrians were careful not to humiliate every captured leader. If a king surrendered before battle, he was often treated with honor and allowed to remain as a vassal. The cruelty was reserved for those who fought, and especially for those who broke oaths of loyalty. This distinction reinforced the message that loyalty brought safety, while rebellion brought a very public end. The effect on other rulers in the region was profound. When word of these ceremonies spread, many chose to negotiate rather than fight. The Assyrian kings had created a system where the fear of a specific fate could be more powerful than any army. And in that sense, the treatment of enemy leaders was not just vengeance. It was a sophisticated tool of statecraft designed to maintain control over a vast empire with relatively few troops. But such a system carries an invisible cost. The more horrific the punishment, the more it breeds deep resentment. And while fear can compel obedience for a time, it cannot build the kind of loyalty that lasts. The seeds of that resentment would one day grow into a harvest the Assyrians could not escape. The Assyrian kings understood that fear must be constantly renewed. So they turned their records of victory into instruments of psychological warfare, designed to reach audiences far beyond the battlefield. The royal annals carved into palace walls and stone monuments were not neutral history. They were carefully crafted messages intended for specific readers, visiting envoys from vassal states, tribute bearers from distant lands, and conquered peoples who came to the capital for official business. These individuals would walk through the grand halls of Nineveh or Nimrud and see, in vivid detail, the fate that awaited anyone who defied the empire. The inscriptions described events that may have been real, but they were often exaggerated to maximize their impact. Numbers of enemies killed were inflated. Descriptions of punishments were made as terrifying as language could convey. The goal was not accuracy but effect. When a foreign ambassador read that the Assyrian king had piled heads in front of a city gate, he was meant to feel a chill of dread. He would return to his own ruler with a report that went beyond facts. He would carry the emotional weight of what he saw carved in stone. In this way, the annals functioned like a warning broadcast across time. They were the ancient equivalent of a propaganda poster, but far more permanent. Every visitor who saw them became a messenger, spreading the empire's reputation without the Assyrians having to send a single soldier. The inscriptions also served as a reminder to the conquered populations who were forcibly resettled near the capital. These people lived in the shadow of palaces decorated with scenes of their own defeat. They could not escape the visual evidence of what happened to those who resisted. The psychological pressure was constant. Even generations later, children growing up in these communities would see the same carvings and hear the same stories. The fear became part of the cultural landscape. One of the most famous examples comes from the annals of Ashurnasirpal II. In his inscriptions, he describes a campaign where he captured a rebel city and then carried out a series of acts that he wrote about in great detail. Modern historians debate the accuracy of these accounts. Some argue that the scribes used stock phrases, a sort of formulaic language that was traditional for royal inscriptions. Whether every detail was factual or not, the intended effect remains clear. The descriptions were meant to horrify and to teach a lesson. A king who did not record such deeds in prominent places was seen as weak. The annals themselves were a performance of power as important as the military victories they described. Over time, this system created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more terrifying the inscriptions, the more likely neighboring rulers were to submit without fighting. And the more submissions the Assyrians received, the more they could claim these victories as proof of their unmatched might. The inscriptions grew more elaborate with each reign, each king trying to surpass his predecessor. The result was a body of text that has survived for millennia, giving us a window into how the Assyrians thought about power. They believed that fear could be stored, preserved, and transmitted across generations through the written word. And in a way, they were right. Even today, reading these ancient annals, we feel the weight of their intention. We understand the message they were sending. The question remains, what happens when a weapon of fear is used for so long that people become numb to it? The Assyrians may have overplayed their hand. When a city refused to surrender, the Assyrian army turned patience into a weapon. Siege warfare was not a quick assault. It was a deliberate process, often lasting months, designed to break a city from the inside out. The Assyrian engineers were masters of their craft. They built enormous earthen ramps against the city walls, sloping pathways that allowed soldiers to wheel heavy battering rams up to the fortifications. These ramps required thousands of workers, many of them prisoners from earlier campaigns, hauling baskets of earth and stone under constant arrow fire from the defenders above. At the same time, specialized teams dug tunnels beneath the walls, propping them with wooden beams. When the tunnel was complete, they set the supports on fire, collapsing the ground above and bringing the wall down in a cascade of rubble. But the most effective weapon was hunger. The Assyrian army would surround a city completely, cutting off all roads and paths that led in or out. No grain could enter. No water could be drawn from wells outside the walls. Over weeks, the stores inside the city dwindled. The Assyrians did not need to storm the walls if starvation did the work for them. One of the most well-documented sieges is that of Lachish, a fortified city in the Kingdom of Judah. In the year 701 before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Sennacherib marched against Lachish after the Judahite king Hezekiah refused to pay tribute. The city was perched on a hill with massive walls that seemed impossible to breach, but the Assyrians built a siege ramp that still survives today. Archaeologists have excavated the site and found the remains of the ramp, along with hundreds of arrowheads, sling stones, and pieces of armor. The reliefs carved into Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh show the siege in stunning detail. They depict Assyrian soldiers advancing behind large shields, battering rams pounding the walls, and defenders falling from the battlements. The reliefs also show the aftermath. Rows of prisoners are led away, their hands bound, their families walking behind them. Some are shown being impaled on stakes, a scene that historians interpret as a public display intended to demoralize any remaining resistance. The text of the annals adds that the city was plundered and its people were taken as captives. The treatment of the inhabitants was not random. The Assyrians distinguished between different groups. The leaders and those who had organized the rebellion were often subjected to public punishment as a warning. The common people, the farmers and craftsmen and their families, were deported to other parts of the empire. They became part of the forced labor force that built the great palaces and irrigation canals of Assyria. This was not cruelty without purpose. It was a calculated system of population management. The skilled workers were valuable assets. The rebellious leaders were liabilities who had to be made examples of. The siege of Lachish became a symbol of Assyrian might. The reliefs were placed in a prominent hall in the palace, visible to every visitor who came to pay tribute. They served the same function as the written annals, a permanent warning carved in stone. But the reliefs also reveal something else. They show the exhaustion of the defenders, the desperation of families inside the walls, the slow death of hope as the weeks dragged on. The Assyrians understood that a city that surrenders quickly suffers less than one that fights to the end. That knowledge itself was a weapon, yet even this method had limits. A city that starved for months might be conquered, but the cost in time and resources was enormous, and every siege left behind a population that remembered. Those who survived and were resettled carried the memory of smoke and hunger and the sight of their homes being torn down. These memories did not fade. They accumulated generation after generation until the day when the Assyrians themselves would face a siege they could not survive. One king took this system of terror to its furthest extreme. Ashurnasirpal II ruled the Assyrian Empire during the 9th century before the Common Era, and his reign became the measuring stick for all who followed. His royal annals are some of the most detailed and unsettling documents to survive from the ancient world, not because they hide the truth, but because they celebrate it openly. Inscriptions carved into the walls of his palace at Nimrud describe scenes that later kings would echo but rarely surpass. The purpose of these records was not to shock for its own sake. It was to broadcast a message so clear that no one in the empire could misunderstand the cost of disobedience. Ashurnasirpal faced a difficult task when he took the throne. The empire had grown rapidly, and controlling such a vast territory required more than armies. It required a reputation that preceded every soldier, so he set out to build that reputation with deliberate care. His campaigns were recorded with a level of detail that suggests a sophisticated understanding of propaganda. He wanted the reports of his actions to travel faster than his troops. And they did. Among the claims made in his annals, one of the most frequently cited involves a rebel city that refused to surrender. After the city fell, the king ordered that the leaders who had organized the resistance be brought forward. According to the inscription, these individuals were subjected to a public ceremony that involved the removal of their skin. The skins were then displayed on the city walls, a lasting monument visible to all who passed. The account also mentions that the children of the rebel leaders were taken into captivity and passed away during the campaign. The language of the annals is direct, but historians interpret these passages as part of a calculated strategy. By describing the fate of entire families, Ashurnasirpal was making a point that resistance endangered not just the fighters but everyone connected to them. This created a powerful deterrent. A potential rebel had to consider not only his own fate but the future of his children and his household. The annals also record that prisoners from conquered cities were impaled on stakes set up around the city walls. This practice was not unique to Ashurnasirpal, but he used it on a larger scale than his predecessors. The stakes were placed at regular intervals so that anyone approaching the city would see the remains before they reached the gates. It was a form of psychological barrier as effective as any wall or ditch. The visual impact of such a display was meant to crush the will of any army that considered attacking. For Ashurnasirpal, these acts were not merely punishment, they were offerings to the Assyrian gods. He saw himself as the divine agent of Ashur, the chief deity of the empire. The suffering of enemies was, in his view, a sacred duty. By recording these deeds in his annals and on palace reliefs, he was giving thanks for divine favor and demonstrating that he was a faithful servant. This religious framing made the harshness of his rule feel justified to his own people. The gods demanded obedience from all nations, and the king was simply carrying out that will. One of the most troubling passages in his annals describes a city where the population included many young people. The text states that some of these individuals were consumed by fire during the capture of the city. Modern scholars debate whether this was a deliberate act of sacrifice or a consequence of the city being set ablaze during the assault. Either way, the event was recorded as a demonstration of total victory. The king wanted future generations to know that no one, regardless of age, could escape the consequences of standing against Assyria. The effect of this reputation was measurable. During Ashurnasirpal's reign, fewer cities chose to fight than in the reigns of earlier kings. Many sent tribute immediately upon hearing that the Assyrian army was approaching. The king had achieved his goal. He had created a climate of fear so intense that surrender seemed the only reasonable choice. Yet this success came at a hidden price. The fear Ashurnasirpal cultivated was not the kind that fades with time. It was the kind that festers, passed down through stories told in whispers around campfires and in the quiet of homes. The very brutality that made his reign efficient also planted deep resentment among the conquered peoples. Decades later, when the empire began to face pressure from outside forces, that resentment would surface in unexpected ways. For now, though, Ashurnasirpal had built a machine of control that seemed unbreakable. The question is whether any system based on such deep fear can ever be stable in the long run. The Assyrian fear machine had a spiritual engine. At the center of their worldview stood Ashur, the chief god from whom the empire took its name. Assyrian kings did not see themselves as mere conquerors. They were high priests of Ashur, chosen to expand his domain across the known world. Every military campaign was a sacred mission. Every victory was an offering. And some historians believe that the most extreme offerings may have involved blood. The evidence for ritual human sacrifice in the Assyrian Empire is controversial and fragmentary. No royal annals openly admit to sacrificing captives to the gods, but a few texts and archaeological clues have led scholars to ask difficult questions. One of the most debated passages comes from the reign of Ashurnasirpal II. In his description of founding a new palace and city at Kalhu, modern Nimrud, he records a grand dedication ceremony. The text mentions that the foundations were sprinkled with the blood of certain individuals. The exact wording has been interpreted in different ways. Some translators argue it refers to the symbolic blood of enemies, a metaphor for total defeat. Others suggest it describes an actual ritual, a foundational offering meant to secure divine favor for the new capital. The practice of foundation sacrifices was not unique to Assyria. In many ancient cultures, builders placed offerings beneath important structures, sometimes including animal sacrifices or symbolic objects. But human remains have been found in contexts that raise questions. At several Assyrian sites, excavators have discovered skeletons buried in corners of buildings, under thresholds, or inside walls. These were not ordinary burials. They lacked grave goods, the personal items people typically placed with their dead. The bodies were often arranged in unusual positions. This has led some archaeologists to propose that these individuals were sacrificial victims, buried to protect the structure from evil forces or to ensure the favor of Ashur. The scholarly debate centers on how frequent and official such practices were. Skeptics point out that the Assyrian textual record is extensive. If human sacrifice were a regular part of state religion, we would expect to find clear descriptions in the thousands of clay tablets that survive. Instead, the references are rare and ambiguous. Proponents of the theory argue that such rites may have been kept secret, restricted to the inner circle of the priesthood and the king. The public annals emphasized military glory, not religious rituals that might be seen as barbaric by other cultures. Another point of contention involves the fate of prisoners after major victories. Assyrian inscriptions often state that captives were either deported, killed, or put to work, but the language used to describe their deaths is sometimes vague. When a text says that prisoners were offered to Ashur, does that mean they were killed in a religious ceremony, or does it simply mean they were dedicated as spoils of war, with their deaths being a normal result of battle? The ambiguity leaves room for interpretation. There is also evidence that the Assyrians practiced forms of symbolic sacrifice. In some reliefs, we see priests pouring liquids over an altar while captives are shown nearby. The scene could represent a ritual purification, not a killing, but the proximity of captives to the altar has made some scholars wonder if the ceremony involved bloodletting in a controlled, sacred context. These debates matter because they reveal how deeply religion and violence were intertwined in Assyrian ideology. The king was not just a ruler, he was the earthly representative of Ashur, tasked with maintaining cosmic order. Disobedience by a vassal was not merely a political act, it was a sin against the divine. Punishing that sin, even harshly, was a religious duty. In that framework, a ritual sacrifice would have been seen as restoring balance, not committing cruelty. The idea that Ashur demanded blood is not far-fetched when we consider the broader context of ancient Near Eastern religions. Many neighboring cultures, including the Canaanites and some Mesopotamian city-states, practiced various forms of human sacrifice at different periods. The Hebrew Bible records prohibitions against such rites, suggesting they were known in the region. The Assyrians, with their emphasis on absolute obedience to their god, may have taken this practice to an extreme, but in a way that fit their worldview. What makes the evidence so tantalizing is that it points to a hidden dimension of Assyrian power. Beyond the visible terror of sieges and deportations, there may have been a secret cultic level where the king and his priests performed rites that bound the empire together through shared, unspoken knowledge. The mere rumor of such ceremonies would have amplified the fear that held the empire in place. Even today, we cannot say with certainty whether the Assyrian kings truly sacrificed humans on a regular basis or whether these were isolated acts dressed up in myth. The answer may lie buried under the ruins of palaces and temples, waiting for future excavation and new interpretations. One thing is clear: the relationship between Ashur and his people was not a gentle one. It demanded total devotion and perhaps the ultimate price. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser III marked a turning point in the machinery of conquest. Before him, the Assyrian army was a seasonal force. Farmers and laborers would leave their fields for a campaign and then return home. This limited how far and how long the empire could project power. Tiglath-Pileser changed that by creating a professional standing army, a force of soldiers who trained year-round and owed their loyalty directly to the king. This reform alone transformed the nature of Assyrian warfare. A standing army meant that campaigns could begin at any time, not just after the harvest. It meant that soldiers were always ready, always drilled, always familiar with the latest tactics. The king no longer had to wait for local nobles to gather their own troops. He had a permanent force at his command, disciplined and loyal, but the reforms went deeper. Tiglath-Pileser also overhauled the logistics of the army. He established supply depots along major routes, stocked with grain, weapons, and equipment. This allowed his soldiers to march faster and farther without stopping to forage. A well-fed army could cover ground that would have exhausted earlier forces. Speed became a weapon in itself. When a rebellion flared in a distant province, the Assyrian response could arrive before the rebels had time to organize. The days of slow, predictable campaigns were over. The new army also incorporated specialized units. Engineers, siege experts, and cavalry became permanent branches of the military. The cavalry in particular gave the Assyrians a decisive advantage. They could outflank enemy formations, harass supply lines, and pursue fleeing opponents with relentless speed. Combined with the standing infantry, these units worked together in coordinated attacks that overwhelmed defenses far more efficiently than the massed charges of earlier eras. Yet these reforms were not just about efficiency, they also made the application of systematic terror more effective. With a professional army, the king could enforce his will with precision. A targeted campaign could destroy a single rebellious city while leaving neighboring regions untouched, a reminder that the empire saw everything and could strike anywhere. The speed of conquest meant that there was little time for cities to prepare their defenses or send for help. Surrender or destruction became the only options. Tiglath-Pileser himself led campaigns that crushed the kingdoms of Syria and parts of Babylon, incorporating them into the empire with shocking speed. The old pattern of long sieges and slow negotiations was replaced by a relentless advance. When a city fell, the consequences were immediate and severe. Deportations happened within days. Leaders were dealt with in a manner that ensured the news traveled faster than any messenger. The new army did not just win battles. It spread fear on a schedule. The psychological impact of these reforms is hard to overstate. Neighboring rulers understood that the old rules of warfare had changed. You could no longer hope that a rebellion would succeed before the main Assyrian force arrived. You could no longer trust that the mountains or deserts would protect you. The professional soldiers of Tiglath-Pileser could march through any terrain, supplied by the depots he had placed along the way. Resistance began to seem futile, and that was exactly the intended effect. But the reforms also increased the scale of destruction. A faster army could cover more ground in a single season, meaning more cities faced the full weight of Assyrian pressure. The standing army did not tire easily. It could campaign year after year, grinding down any region that refused to submit. The result was a cycle. The more efficiently the Assyrians conquered, the more territory they had to control, and the more they needed a professional force to maintain order. The system fed on itself. Tiglath-Pileser III did not invent cruelty. He simply gave it a more efficient delivery system. The old brutality remained, but now it arrived faster and more relentlessly than ever before. And in doing so, he locked the empire into a path where military strength and harsh rule became inseparable, a path that would define Assyria for the rest of its history. Sennacherib's assault on Babylon was unlike any campaign before it. Babylon was not just another city. It was the ancient heart of Mesopotamian civilization, a place of towering ziggurats and libraries filled with tablets that preserved the wisdom of centuries. For generations, Assyrian kings had treated Babylon with a mix of respect and rivalry, acknowledging its cultural supremacy even as they sought to control it politically. They would enter the city as conquerors, but they would also make offerings at its temples and honor its gods. Sennacherib broke that tradition in the most dramatic way possible. In the year 689 before the Common Era, after a series of rebellions led by Babylonian leaders, Sennacherib decided that the city itself must be punished. He ordered his army to dismantle the walls, tear down the temples, and break the sacred statues of Babylonian deities. The great statue of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, was removed from its shrine and taken to Assyria. This was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual annihilation. The removal of a god statue meant that the deity had abandoned the city, leaving it vulnerable to chaos. The Assyrian engineers then carried out an act that still echoes in historical memory. They diverted the canals that fed the Euphrates River, channeling the water to flood the ruins of the city. The waters rose over the broken walls, covering the streets and the foundations of the temples. Babylon, the city that had once been the center of the known world, was turned into a swamp. Sennacherib's own inscriptions describe the event with a kind of grim satisfaction. He wrote that he had made the site of Babylon like a meadow, that the water would wash away all memory of its former glory. For the Assyrian king, this was justice. He had crushed the heart of rebellion, ensuring that no one could ever again use Babylon as a rallying point. But the destruction created a deep wound in the cultural landscape of Mesopotamia. Babylon had been a sacred city for millennia. Its scholars had developed astronomy, mathematics, and law. The famous Code of Hammurabi had been carved in Babylon centuries before. To destroy such a place was not just an act of vengeance, it was a deliberate erasure of shared heritage. Later Assyrian kings, including Sennacherib's own son Esarhaddon, would attempt to rebuild Babylon and restore its statues. They recognized that the destruction had been a mistake, that the empire could not afford to alienate the cultural and religious heart of the region. The rebuilding effort was costly and took decades, but the memory of what Sennacherib had done never fully healed. The destruction of Babylon stands as a stark example of what happens when imperial vengeance overrides practical wisdom. A king blinded by anger can destroy what no army can rebuild, and in doing so, he plants the seeds of future resentment. For the people who had once looked to Babylon as a symbol of civilization, the sight of their sacred city lying underwater was a reminder that the Assyrian Empire was not merely powerful. It was willing to sacrifice history itself for the sake of control. That lesson would not be forgotten. Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh was a museum of warnings, and the most famous exhibit depicted the siege of Lachish. The carvings stretched across room after room, covering entire walls with scenes of war. Visitors walked through a corridor lined with images that told a complete story. The approach of the army, the construction of the siege ramp, the assault on the walls, and finally the aftermath. Every detail was deliberate. The Assyrian soldiers are shown in perfect formation, their shields overlapping, their ladders climbing the walls. The defenders fall from the battlements. The wall crumbles under the battering ram. Nothing is left to chance, but the most striking panels are those that show what happened after the city fell. In one section, rows of prisoners are led away with ropes around their necks. Their hands are bound, their families walk behind them, heads bowed. The message is clear: defiance leads to deportation. In another panel, bodies of the defeated are shown impaled on tall stakes arranged in rows around the city. The image is not a random battlefield scene. It is a calculated composition meant to emphasize order, control, and finality. The stakes are evenly spaced, the bodies are neat, almost ceremonial. The visual language tells the viewer that this is not chaos. This is justice as the Assyrian king defined it. Every visitor who entered the throne room of Sennacherib's palace would have seen these reliefs. They were not hidden in a private chamber. They lined the main route that ambassadors, tribute bearers, and conquered rulers had to walk. Imagine the effect on a man who had come from a small kingdom that was considering rebellion. He would see the fate of Lachish, a city that had once been strong. He would see the rows of stakes, the endless line of prisoners, the walls broken and burning. And he would understand that the same fate awaited his own people if his king chose to resist. The reliefs served as a permanent, unspoken threat. They required no translation. No scribe had to read the annals aloud. The images spoke directly to anyone who looked at them. This was propaganda at its most effective, visual, immediate, and unforgettable. The Assyrian artists were masters of their craft. They carved the muscles of the soldiers with care, showing the strength and discipline of the army. They showed the king himself standing on a throne above the battlefield, larger than the other figures, watching the destruction with calm authority. Sennacherib is not fighting. He does not need to. His presence alone is enough to command victory. The message for any visiting ruler was simple: you cannot defeat this army, and you cannot escape this king's reach. Even centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the reliefs in the 1800s, the emotional impact remained. The images are still powerful, still disturbing. They show a level of organization and intentional cruelty that is hard to process. But for the Assyrians, this was not cruelty. It was order. It was the proper consequence of sin against the gods. By displaying these scenes publicly, the king was both glorifying himself and reinforcing the religious and political structure of the empire. The reliefs of Lachish survive today in the British Museum, removed from their original context. But even in a glass case, they retain their purpose. They are a window into how one empire used art as a weapon of psychological control. They remind us that propaganda is not a modern invention. It is as old as the need to rule over unwilling people, and the Assyrians perfected it to a level that still speaks across 3,000 years. The Assyrian king may have been the most informed ruler in the ancient world. Behind the grand reliefs and public ceremonies lay a vast, hidden network of informants that stretched across every province and into enemy courts. These were not spies in the modern sense, people in cloaks passing secrets in the dark. They were official agents, scribes, and loyal officials whose job was to watch, listen, and report back to the capital. The system was remarkably sophisticated. Cuneiform tablets discovered in the royal archives at Nineveh contain hundreds of reports sent directly to the king. Some are from provincial governors updating him on local harvests or troop movements. Others are from court officials describing conversations they overheard. A few are from people whose only job seems to have been to monitor other officials and report any sign of disloyalty. One tablet, written by a man named Nabu-Shumuwidina, begins with a simple statement: "To the king, my lord, your servant Nabu-Shumuwidina, good health to my lord." Then it goes on to describe a series of suspicious gatherings at the home of a high-ranking administrator. The report does not accuse anyone outright. It simply notes who attended, what they discussed, and how long the meeting lasted. The king was expected to draw his own conclusions. The existence of such reports created an atmosphere of constant suspicion. No official could be sure who around him was sending messages to the palace. A governor might entertain a visiting noble, only to discover days later that the king had received a detailed account of the conversation. This uncertainty was a powerful tool of control. It kept even the most powerful men from plotting openly because they never knew which of their own servants might be a royal informant. In addition to internal surveillance, the Assyrians also maintained agents in foreign courts. Ambassadors and merchants traveling abroad were expected to send back intelligence on the military strength, alliances, and morale of other kingdoms. Some of these agents served for years, embedding themselves in distant capitals. They wrote in a coded language using euphemisms and oblique references so that even if their letters were intercepted, the true meaning would be hidden. A phrase like "the garden is well watered" might mean that the enemy army is well supplied. A reference to a sick horse could indicate a weakening ruler. The system required careful record-keeping. Scribes in the palace maintained files on every official and every province, cross-referencing reports to check for inconsistencies. If two reports from the same region contradicted each other, the king would order an investigation. The possibility of being caught in a lie was as frightening as the punishment for disloyalty. This constant oversight had a chilling effect on dissent. Ambitious nobles thought twice before gathering supporters. Local leaders hesitated to voice complaints about heavy taxation or forced labor. The fear of being reported by a neighbor or a subordinate kept the empire running smoothly on the surface, even as resentment simmered below. The network of informants was not foolproof. Some reports were motivated by personal grudges, false accusations designed to eliminate rivals. The king had to weigh each piece of information carefully. A greedy official might denounce an innocent man to seize his property, but the very existence of the system, the knowledge that someone was always watching, was enough to deter all but the most determined conspirators. In the end, surveillance became another form of psychological pressure, invisible but ever present. It meant that every conversation, every letter, every alliance carried a hidden risk. The Assyrian Empire was not just an army with swords and siege engines. It was a network of eyes and ears collecting information from every corner of the known world. And the king, seated in his palace at Nineveh, knew more about his subjects than they could imagine. That knowledge was a weapon as sharp as any blade, and it helped keep the empire unified for generations. But even the most thorough surveillance cannot prevent every rebellion. Trust, once broken, is hard to restore, and when the whispers of discontent grow loud enough, no amount of watching can hold them back. Yet even the most watching eyes could not prevent every challenge from emerging. When a province did rise in defiance, the response was swift and absolute. And perhaps no single event illustrates this more dramatically than the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century before the Common Era. The biblical account describes a siege that lasted 3 years. The Assyrian king Shalmaneser V surrounded the capital city of Samaria, cutting it off from supplies and reinforcements. When the walls finally gave way, the kingdom of Israel ceased to exist, but the aftermath was not simply a military victory. It was the beginning of a profound transformation that would echo across history. According to the second book of Kings, the Assyrians carried the people of Israel away into exile, settling them in distant regions near the Habba River and in the mountains of Media. This was not a random scattering, it was a deliberate policy designed to erase national identity. The Assyrian king who completed the conquest, Sargon II, left behind his own record of the event. In his royal annals, carved into the walls of his palace at Khorsabad, he claimed to have deported 27,290 people from Samaria. The number itself is remarkable for its precision. Sargon was not boasting in vague terms. He was accounting for the population as if they were goods to be inventoried. The captives were marched eastward along the great royal roads that the Assyrians had built to move their armies. Families walked for weeks carrying what little they could. The elderly and the very young faced the hardest journey. Many did not complete it. Those who arrived were settled in clusters among existing populations where they were vastly outnumbered. The goal was assimilation through isolation. Deprived of their own leadership, their own priests, and their own land, the exiles would eventually adopt the customs and language of their new neighbors. Over generations, their distinct identity would fade like a footprint in wind-blown sand. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of deliberate resettlement. Excavations in the region of the Habba River have uncovered pottery and building styles that match those from the northern kingdom of Israel. These are not native to the area. They appear suddenly at the same time as the Assyrian conquest and then gradually disappear over the following centuries. The material culture tells a story of a people trying to maintain their traditions in a foreign land, slowly losing the battle against time and pressure. What makes this event so significant in both historical and cultural memory is what happened next. The 10 northern tribes of Israel, as they came to be called, largely vanished from the written record. They did not return to their homeland. They did not rebuild their kingdom. Their descendants blended into the populations of Assyria, Babylon, and Media, and their name became attached to a mystery that has captivated scholars and storytellers for millennia. The term lost tribes carries a sense of adventure, of hidden kingdoms waiting to be discovered, but the reality is far more ordinary and far more tragic. They were not lost in the sense of wandering. They were deliberately disappeared, absorbed into an empire that saw cultural diversity as a threat to be eliminated. The Assyrians understood something fundamental about human identity. It is fragile. It depends on shared language, shared stories, and shared space. Remove any one of those elements, and the bonds that hold a people together begin to fray. Remove all three, as the Assyrians did, and the fabric can tear beyond repair. The scattering of the northern tribes was not an accident of war. It was a calculated act of cultural engineering, designed to prevent the conquered from ever rising again. And for the most part, it worked. The kingdom of Israel never reformed. The tribes never came back. Their story became a cautionary tale, preserved in scripture and in the annals of their conquerors, a reminder of what happens when a people loses its homeland. Yet, even in this erasure, a thread of continuity remains. The Assyrian records themselves, unearthed by archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries, confirm the biblical account in remarkable detail. The names of the kings match, the date of the conquest aligns, the policy of deportation is described in both sources. History and tradition, often at odds, here speak with a single voice. What we cannot know is the inner life of those exiles, the quiet moments around campfires at night, the songs sung in a language their children would soon forget. That silence is the deepest legacy of the Assyrian policy of disappearance. Outside the walls of Jerusalem, something strange happened. The Assyrian army, fresh from crushing the fortified city of Lachish and devastating the countryside of Judah, had surrounded the capital. King Hezekiah had prepared for the worst, reinforcing the walls and securing the water supply through a tunnel carved through solid rock. The city should have fallen, just as Samaria had fallen, just as Lachish had fallen. But it did not. According to the biblical account in the second book of Kings and the book of Isaiah, the Assyrian camp suffered a sudden and devastating blow. That night, an angel of the Lord passed through the camp and struck down 185,000 soldiers. By morning, the Assyrian king Sennacherib withdrew and returned to Nineveh. Jerusalem was saved. Historians have long debated what really happened that night. The biblical explanation is one of faith, but scholars search for a natural cause. The most common theory is that a sudden outbreak of illness swept through the Assyrian camp. an epidemic could have spread rapidly among soldiers crowded into tents, weakened by weeks of campaigning. The Assyrian army had marched through swampy regions near the Tigris and Euphrates, and diseases like typhoid or cholera could have decimated their ranks. A second theory points to a rebellion elsewhere in the empire. While Sennacherib was occupied in the west, the Babylonian chronicles record that his rival Merodach-Baladan was stirring trouble in the south. Perhaps the king received urgent news that his throne was in danger and decided to abandon the campaign to protect his home base. A third idea involves logistics. The Assyrian supply line stretched over hundreds of miles. A failed harvest or a disruption in the delivery of food and water could have forced the army to retreat before starvation set in. Each explanation has its supporters, but none fully account for why Sennacherib, who recorded his victories in such precise detail, left no mention of the siege of Jerusalem in his annals. His famous account of the campaign against Judah describes the conquest of 46 fortified cities and the deportation of over 200,000 people. He boasts that he trapped Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, but he never claims to have captured the city. The silence is deafening. For a king who documented even the most brutal punishments, the omission of a victory is telling. The dark alternative is that the Assyrian chronicles deliberately omitted a humiliating defeat. If Sennacherib had been forced to withdraw under circumstances that damaged his reputation, his scribes would have had every reason to erase the event from the official record. In the Assyrian worldview, a king was chosen by the gods to be invincible. A failure to conquer a single city, especially after proclaiming the campaign a success, would have been a stain on his divine mandate. Better to leave it out entirely. This theory gains weight when we consider that later Assyrian records mention the campaign but not the outcome, as if the scribes themselves were unsure how to frame it. The mystery of Jerusalem stands as a rare moment where the conqueror's story breaks. For once, the empire met something it could not overcome, whether that something was a divine hand, a sudden illness, or the limits of its own reach. The event left a deep mark on the cultural memory of the region. For the people of Judah, the deliverance of Jerusalem became a central story of their identity, proof that their God was greater than the gods of Assyria. The unanswered question lingers: what really forced Sennacherib to turn back? The truth may lie buried in the ruins of Nineveh, waiting for a scholar to piece together the fragments of a story the Assyrians themselves tried to hide. The palace of Nineveh hid a second army, one that wielded no swords but controlled the flow of power. Eunuchs, men who had been physically altered in a way that prevented them from having children, occupied some of the highest positions in the Assyrian Empire. Kings trusted them because they could not found dynasties of their own. A eunuch could amass wealth and influence, but he could never pass it to a son. This made him uniquely dependent on the king's favor and theoretically free from the ambition that drove noble families to plot for the throne. The logic was simple: a man with no heirs had no reason to build a competing legacy. Yet this very trust created a new kind of danger. The eunuchs became a powerful faction within the court, their influence growing with each generation. They controlled access to the king, managed royal correspondence, and oversaw the vast network of informants. They were the gatekeepers of information, deciding what reached the ruler's ears and what was filtered out. Provincial governors and military commanders learned that offending a senior eunuch could mean the end of a career or worse. The eunuchs developed their own internal hierarchy, with rivalries and alliances as complex as any noble house. Though they could not produce heirs, they could adopt protégés or form bonds of loyalty with younger eunuchs, creating chains of influence that stretched across decades. The palace became a maze of whispered conversations and secret agreements. A king who relied too heavily on his eunuchs could find himself isolated, surrounded by advisors whose primary loyalty was to each other. Historical records from the reign of Ashurbanipal reveal moments of intense tension. One tablet describes a eunuch named Nabu-Sharu-Uzer who rose to become one of the most powerful officials in the empire. He led military campaigns, negotiated treaties, and collected taxes from conquered provinces, but his influence bred enemies. Another tablet mentions a conspiracy within the palace, a plot involving several eunuchs who allegedly planned to remove the king and place a different ruler on the throne. The details are fragmentary, but the accusation alone shows that the very mechanism designed to prevent rebellion could become its own source of instability. The eunuchs' unique position gave them both power and vulnerability. They were trusted because they were seen as neutral, but that neutrality made them ideal intermediaries in any plot. A noble who wanted to communicate secretly with a rival faction could use a eunuch as a messenger, knowing that the eunuch had no family ties to either side. This made the palace a place of constant intrigue, where every friendly gesture might hide a hidden agenda. The Assyrian kings responded by playing their eunuchs against each other, promoting one and demoting another to keep the balance of power shifting. But this delicate dance could not last forever. When a weak king took the throne, the eunuchs sometimes seized the opportunity to act on their own ambitions. The same system that had stabilized the empire for centuries could also tear it apart from within. The legacy of the eunuchs is a reminder that even the most carefully designed systems of control have hidden weaknesses. Trust, no matter how calculated, can be misplaced, and the very people who are supposed to prevent betrayal may themselves become the architects of the next crisis. The Assyrian army did not just conquer cities, it conquered gods. When a temple fell, the soldiers did not simply loot its treasures. They systematically smashed the statues of the local deities, shattered the altars, and set the sacred buildings ablaze. This was not random destruction, it was a deliberate act of theological war. The goal was to prove, in the most visible way possible, that the gods of the conquered were weaker than Ashur. In the ancient world, the survival of a temple was seen as a direct reflection of divine power. A god whose shrine stood untouched was a god worth following. A god whose statue lay broken in the rubble was a god who had failed. The Assyrians understood this logic perfectly, and they weaponized it. After a victory, the royal annals often describe the removal of sacred statues from their pedestals. These images were transported back to Nineveh and placed in the temple of Ashur, a gesture that meant the defeated god was now a servant or even a prisoner of the Assyrian supreme deity. For the conquered people, this was a profound spiritual humiliation. Their protector had been captured, their prayers proven useless. The effect on morale was devastating. But the destruction went beyond symbolism. Temples were also centers of community identity, storing records, hosting festivals, and anchoring the social order. Burning them erased not just a building but generations of tradition. The smoke rising from a sacred site was a message that all had seen. The old world was gone, and a new order demanded total submission. By targeting the spiritual foundations of a society, the Assyrians aimed to break the will to resist at its deepest root. A people who believed their gods had abandoned them were far less likely to muster the courage for another rebellion. The policy was applied unevenly. Some local deities were absorbed into the Assyrian pantheon, their statues treated with respect if the region surrendered peacefully. But those who fought faced the full theological assault. This selective application reinforced the basic bargain of the empire: cooperate and retain your sacred traditions, resist and watch them burn. The memory of those destroyed shrines lingered for generations, a wound that no treaty could heal. Even after rebuilding, the absence of the old statues left a silence in the temples that worshippers could not ignore. And that silence became part of the larger story of Assyrian dominance, a reminder that the empire fought not just with swords but with the very idea of divine power. The ground itself kept the secret for nearly 3,000 years. Archaeologists digging at the site of ancient Tushhan, a city that fell to the Assyrian campaigns, uncovered something that matched the royal annals in chilling detail. A mass burial pit, carefully excavated, held the remains of dozens of individuals. The bones told a story that no inscription could fully capture. Forensic examination revealed that many of the skeletons had been decapitated. Others showed cut marks on the arms and legs consistent with the removal of hands or feet. The injuries were not the random wounds of battle. They were deliberate, made with precision, and they occurred after death. This was not simply the aftermath of a fight. It was a systematic act carried out on people who were already helpless. At Lachish, the same pattern emerged. In the 1930s, a British expedition led by archaeologist James Starkey uncovered a massive pit outside the city walls. Inside were hundreds of skeletons, men, women, and children, piled together without any sign of formal burial. The bones were jumbled, suggesting they had been thrown into the pit hastily. Many skulls showed fractures caused by blunt force. Some had been separated from the bodies entirely. The discovery provided physical evidence for the scenes carved on Sennacherib's palace reliefs, scenes that had once been dismissed by some scholars as propaganda. Now the bones confirmed that the carvings were not exaggerations. The brutality depicted in stone was real. For archaeologists, these mass graves are windows into a dark chapter of human history. They show us that ancient texts were not merely metaphorical. When an Assyrian king wrote that he piled up heads like grain, he may have been describing an actual practice. The skeletal evidence reveals the specific methods used: decapitation, mutilation, and public display. But the graves also raised difficult questions. Who were these individuals? Were they soldiers from the defending army, or were they civilians caught in the siege? The mix of ages and the presence of women and children at some sites suggests that the line between combatant and non-combatant was not respected. The Assyrian approach to total war did not distinguish between those who fought and those who merely lived in a rebellious city. The finds have reshaped how historians understand Assyrian rule. What was once seen as literary hyperbole is now recognized as a form of historical record, gruesome but accurate. The bones speak a language that transcends cultural bias. They do not boast or exaggerate, they simply lie in the earth waiting to be found. Each skeleton is a person who once had a name, a family, a life that was cut short by the machinery of empire. The mass graves remind us that the cost of maintaining such a system was paid in human lives, and that the evidence of that cost is still being unearthed today. Those bones were not only from battlefields, they came from construction sites as well. The grand palaces, the towering walls, and the sprawling irrigation canals of Nineveh were built on a foundation of human exhaustion. Every monument that proclaimed Assyrian glory was raised by the hands of people who had no choice in the matter. Deportees from conquered lands, prisoners of war, and even local laborers pressed into service formed a vast workforce that toiled under conditions historians describe as relentless. The scale of these projects was staggering. Nineveh's walls, for example, stretched over 7 miles and rose to a height that allowed chariots to ride along the top. One of Sennacherib's greatest achievements was a canal system that brought fresh water from the mountains, a feat of engineering that required cutting through solid rock for miles. The inscriptions boast of the construction, but they rarely mention the cost in human life. The evidence lies in the burial grounds near these sites, where archaeologists have found rows of graves containing the remains of workers who showed signs of extreme physical stress. Their bones bear the marks of heavy lifting, repetitive motion, and malnutrition. Many were buried without any formal ceremony, a sign that their lives were considered expendable. For the empire, this labor was as essential as the army itself. Each new building project required a constant supply of workers, and the supply came directly from the endless stream of captives brought in by military campaigns. A system of forced relocation and deportation was not only about breaking resistance, it was about feeding the engine of construction. the Assyrian kings understood that monuments were a form of power, visible statements of dominance that would outlast any single generation. But each stone in those walls represented a story of hardship. The workers lived in crowded camps near the construction sites, guarded by soldiers who enforced long hours with whips and chains. Food was scarce and of poor quality. Disease spread quickly in the close quarters. The death rate was high enough that replacements were constantly needed. This created a tragic cycle. The more the empire conquered, the more workers it acquired, and the more it built, the more it needed to conquer again to replenish the workforce. The human cost is impossible to calculate precisely, but estimates from modern historians suggest that tens of thousands of men, women, and even children died during these projects. The canals, the palaces, and the walls of Nineveh were built not just with stone and mortar, but with the sweat and ultimately the lives of the conquered. Yet the Assyrian view of this sacrifice was entirely different. To them, the suffering of foreign captives was irrelevant. The monuments were offerings to the gods and symbols of the king's power. The workers were simply tools, no different from the oxen that dragged the stones. The legacy of those laborers is invisible in the grand narratives of history. Their names are lost, their individual stories erased. Only the silent bones remain, buried beneath the ruins of the very structures they were forced to build. And those structures, however magnificent, carry a weight that no guidebook can capture. They remind us that every great civilization rests on a foundation that is not always visible and not always glorious. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh is often celebrated as one of the greatest achievements of the ancient world, a vast collection of over 30,000 clay tablets that preserve the literature, science, and religion of Mesopotamia. But its creation was not simply an act of scholarly curiosity. It was a calculated move in a much larger game of cultural control. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, understood that knowledge was a form of power as potent as any army. By gathering texts from across his domain and from neighboring lands, he was not just preserving wisdom, he was centralizing it. Every tablet that arrived in Nineveh passed through the hands of royal scribes who decided what was worth keeping and what could be discarded. This selection process was deeply political. Omen collections, medical recipes, astronomical observations, and religious hymns from Babylon and other conquered cities were copied, translated, and stored in the palace. But the originals were often not returned. The king's librarians effectively created a monopoly on authoritative knowledge. If you wanted to consult the sacred traditions of your ancestors, you had to send a request to Nineveh, and the answer might come back altered or incomplete. This was a form of intellectual disarmament. The Assyrians were systematically removing the foundations of rival cultures by absorbing their written heritage. The library held the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation story, and countless other works that are now considered treasures of world literature. But the same archive also contained texts that were never meant to be seen by outsiders: royal decrees, secret rituals, and lists of enemy spies. Ashurbanipal boasted that he could read the difficult script of the ancient Sumerians, that he was a scholar as well as a warrior. This personal involvement signaled that the king considered himself the ultimate guardian of all knowledge. Yet there is a darker aspect to this story. The same libraries that collected texts also participated in their destruction. When Assyrian armies conquered a city, they often burned its temples and palaces, not only as military targets but as acts of cultural erasure. The clay tablets of a defeated enemy would be shattered or melted in the flames. The loss was not accidental. It was the logical conclusion of a policy that viewed rival traditions as threats to be eliminated. A people without their sacred writings, without their histories and legal codes, were far easier to control. The library at Nineveh was thus both a sanctuary and a prison. It safeguarded some of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, but it did so by stripping them of their original context and placing them under the authority of a single ruler. The knowledge that survived did so because it served Assyrian purposes. The knowledge that was lost is gone forever, its contents known only through fragmentary references in the tablets that remain. The irony is that the library's own destruction helped preserve it. When Nineveh fell in 612 before the Common Era, a fire swept through the palace, baking the clay tablets into a hard, durable form that would survive for millennia buried under rubble. The very disaster that ended the empire preserved its intellectual legacy for our discovery, but we must remember that the library was not a neutral storehouse. It was a weapon as carefully aimed as any battering ram, designed to shape what people would remember and what they would forget. And in that sense, Ashurbanipal succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The texts that have come down to us are the ones he chose to keep. The silence of what was destroyed is a silence that still echoes. The law did not stop at the gates of the palace. It reached into every home, every marketplace, and every field, governing the smallest details of daily existence with a severity that is difficult to grasp today. The Assyrian legal code was not a single document like a modern constitution, but a collection of rulings, precedents, and royal decrees that were recorded on clay tablets and stored in the libraries of the empire. What survives of this legal system paints a picture of a society where harsh physical punishment was the normal consequence for offenses that we might consider minor. For example, the theft of a single object from a temple or a palace could result in the loss of a hand. The logic was not purely punitive, it was practical. A thief who could no longer grasp or carry items would find it far harder to repeat the offense. This kind of penalty was applied not only to the poor but to anyone who broke the rules regardless of social standing. The surviving legal tablets list specific fines and punishments for everything from damaging a neighbor's crop to insulting an official. But where modern systems might rely on monetary fines or imprisonment, the Assyrian approach often turned to the body itself as the site of payment. Adultery, for instance, could result in severe beatings or public humiliation. Debtors who could not repay what they owed faced forced labor, sometimes for years, working off their obligation in the service of the creditor or the state. The effect on everyday life was a constant awareness that a single mistake could lead to permanent change. People moved through their routines with a caution that we can barely imagine. A farmer who accidentally let his ox stray into a neighbor's field might be required to compensate with grain, but if he could not pay, the penalty could escalate to a beating or even the loss of an ear. The tablets record cases where a man who struck a pregnant woman and caused harm was required to pay a heavy fine, but if the woman died, the penalty could be the life of the offender's own daughter. This notion of collective responsibility meant that a person's crime could ripple outward, endangering family members. The system was designed to deter through fear, but also to enforce a rigid social order. Everyone knew their place and the consequences of stepping out of it. For the empire, this harsh legal code served the same purpose as the terrifying annals and the public displays of punishment after conquest. It maintained control from the inside out, shaping behavior through the threat of pain and loss. Yet the code also provided a form of stability because the rules were predictable. If a man knew that stealing a sheep would cost him 2 hands, he might think twice, but he also knew exactly what the penalty was. There was no room for mercy or interpretation in many cases, but there was also no room for arbitrary cruelty by local officials. The law applied to everyone, at least in theory. This blend of predictability and severity created a society where order was maintained through a constant low level of threat. People did not rebel because the cost of failure was too high, and they followed the rules because the alternative was unthinkable. The legal system was another pillar of the empire's architecture of fear, invisible but always present, shaping lives from the cradle to the grave. And like the other pillars, it carried a hidden cost, for a society that governs through fear alone may generate obedience, but it also generates deep resentment that waits for the moment when the system shows any sign of weakness. After a city fell, the treatment of its people followed a harsh pattern that was recorded in the annals and carved into palace reliefs. The images and text show that women and children were not simply taken as prisoners of war. They were subjected to a form of systematic abuse designed to break the spirit of any remaining resistance. The Assyrian kings described, in their own words, how captives were distributed among soldiers or sold into slavery. The language of the inscriptions is clinical, listing numbers and destinations, but the reality behind those words was one of profound suffering. For the women of a conquered city, capture often meant being separated from their families and forced into a life of servitude where their bodies were no longer their own. The Assyrian strategy used this violation as a weapon, knowing that the fear of such a fate would spread far ahead of the army. When a neighboring kingdom heard reports of what happened to women after a siege, the will to organize resistance often crumbled before the first Assyrian soldier appeared on the horizon. This was not an accident or a side effect of war. It was a deliberate tactic as carefully planned as any siege ramp. The reliefs from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh show lines of captives being led away, their hands bound, their faces turned downward. These are not just generic figures, they are individuals whose stories were erased by the empire's need to control through terror. The trauma experienced by these captives rippled outward, affecting families and communities for generations. Children who grew up in captivity carried the weight of that experience into their adult lives, passing down stories of loss and displacement. The Assyrian system of conquest was total, reaching into the most intimate spheres of human existence. Nothing was left untouched, and the memory of that suffering did not fade with the empire's fall. It became part of the cultural memory of the region, a cautionary tale that survived in the writings of those who came after. The humans caught in that machinery were not just statistics in a royal inscription. They were mothers, daughters, sons, and fathers whose lives were severed from everything they knew. Their silence in the historical record is one of the deepest losses of the ancient world, but the echo of their experience still reaches us across the centuries, asking us to remember that behind every empire's rise lies a human cost that can never be fully counted. The most famous garden of the ancient world may have never stood in Babylon at all. For centuries, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon have been celebrated as one of the seven wonders, a terraced paradise of exotic plants and flowing water rising in the desert. But no trace of such a garden has ever been found in Babylon despite extensive excavation. Instead, a growing number of historians now believe that the real Hanging Gardens were built by Sennacherib, not in Babylon but in his own capital city of Nineveh. The evidence comes from the king's own inscriptions, which describe in precise detail a palace and a garden that used a remarkable system of water-lifting devices. He wrote of a great bronze screw, like a giant Archimedes screw, that drew water from the Tigris River and channeled it up to the highest terraces. The garden was planted with cypress, cedar, and fruit trees brought from across the empire, creating a lush green mountain in the middle of the dry plains. To make this possible, Sennacherib ordered the construction of one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the ancient world. A massive aqueduct over 50 miles long was carved through hills and carried across valleys on stone bridges. The best-preserved section at Jerwan still stands today, a testament to the skill of Assyrian builders. Water flowed from the mountains through this channel, feeding the gardens and the city. But the construction of this aqueduct came at a profound cost. The laborers who cut the stone, dug the channels, and raised the arches were not volunteers. They were prisoners of war, deportees from conquered lands, people who had been torn from their homes and forced to work under the watch of armed guards. The inscriptions mention that thousands of men were employed, but they do not record how many died from exhaustion or from accidents on the steep slopes. The same hands that had once farmed their own fields or built their own homes were now building a monument to the king who had destroyed their world. There is a dark irony in this legacy. A structure that later generations would remember as a wonder of human creativity, a symbol of beauty and abundance, was actually a product of systematic suffering. The gardens of Nineveh were not a gift to the people. They were a demonstration of absolute power, a statement that the king could command nature itself and reshape the land to his will. By building a green mountain in the middle of an arid plain, Sennacherib was claiming a power that belonged only to the gods, and like so many Assyrian projects, the water that flowed through the aqueduct was not just irrigation. It was a quiet message written in stone and water, a message that said, "Everything you see, the water, the trees, the very earth beneath your feet, belongs to the one who commands the armies." The beauty of the hanging gardens was real, but it was a beauty built on a foundation of forced labor and human loss. And when Nineveh fell, the gardens fell with it, leaving behind only the silent stone of the aqueduct and the question of what we choose to remember. Not every sacrifice left a clear mark in the archaeological record, but some fragments of evidence have led historians to ask uncomfortable questions about the deepest reaches of Assyrian religious practice. When the empire faced existential threats such as a devastating plague or a rebellion that shook the throne, the king and his priests may have turned to rituals that went far beyond the usual offerings of grain and animals. The textual clues are ambiguous, scattered across a handful of tablets that describe ceremonies performed during times of extreme crisis. One such tablet, dating from the reign of Esarhaddon, mentions a ritual intended to purify the kingdom after a period of upheaval. The text speaks of a substitute, a person who would bear the community's troubles and then be removed. In neighboring cultures, such substitute rituals sometimes involved a human being who was treated like royalty for a short time before being sent away or put to death. Whether the Assyrians followed this practice with children is unclear. The tablets use vague language, and no surviving explicit command from an Assyrian king orders such an act. Yet archaeologists have uncovered infant burials at the foundations of some buildings, arranged in a way that suggests they were not ordinary deaths. These remains are often placed beneath thresholds or at the corners of temples, positions that in other ancient societies indicated a foundation offering. The pattern is not unique to Assyria, but its presence within the empire raises the possibility that children were considered the most precious gift a community could offer to secure divine favor in desperate times. The evidence is fiercely debated. Skeptics point out that infant mortality was high in the ancient world, and many burials may simply be the result of disease or stillbirth placed in a reverent spot. Proponents of the sacrifice theory argue that the deliberate placement and the lack of normal grave goods point to a different purpose. The truth may never be known with certainty, but the idea itself tells us something about the Assyrian worldview. In a system where the king was the divine representative of Ashur, and where cosmic order depended on absolute obedience, no price was too high to restore balance when the empire trembled. The royal funerary rituals of Assyrian kings also contain hints of extreme measures. When a ruler died, his household would accompany him to the afterlife according to some inscriptions. Servants and officials were sometimes killed at the tomb so they could continue their duties in the next world. Whether children were ever included in these proceedings remains a matter of speculation, but the mere possibility underscores how deep the commitment to religious duty could go. The Assyrians believed that the gods demanded everything, and in moments of profound fear, everything might include the most innocent lives. These shadows of evidence are hard to interpret, but they remind us that the machinery of terror was not limited to enemies on the battlefield. It reached into the most intimate corners of the culture, touching the very idea of what it meant to be faithful. The silence of the historical record on this subject is perhaps the most telling detail of all. One of the most secret tools in the Assyrian arsenal was not a siege weapon or a public display of punishment, but a group of highly trained operatives who worked in silence. These elite assassination squads are mentioned in scattered royal correspondence, brief references that hint at a hidden layer of imperial control. The tablets describe messengers carrying sealed orders to trusted officials, instructions to deal with a troublesome governor or a foreign leader who had begun to plot against the empire. The language is careful, never openly stating the act itself. A phrase like "he must be removed from the equation" appears more than once. The existence of these squads reveals that the Assyrian kings understood a simple truth: not every threat could be met with open force. Sometimes a rebellion could be prevented by removing a single individual before the plan took shape. A charismatic leader in a distant province might rally support among the discontented. If that leader were to suddenly fall ill or disappear, the movement would collapse before it began. The operatives were chosen for their loyalty and their discretion. They came from the ranks of the palace guard, men who had proven themselves in battle and who had no personal ties to the regions where they were sent. They traveled without fanfare, often disguised as merchants or travelers, carrying authorization tablets that identified them to local Assyrian officials. Their methods were not recorded in detail, but the results appear in the historical gaps, the moments when a potential rebellion simply never ignited. One particularly revealing letter from the reign of Esarhaddon describes a situation in the city of Haran, where a group of local nobles had been meeting in secret. The king's informant reported the names and the general nature of their discussions. The response from the palace was swift. A few weeks later, one of the nobles died unexpectedly. The others stopped meeting. The letter does not say what happened, but the implication is clear. The empire maintained its grip not only through public terror but through precise, invisible strikes. This system allowed the king to manage threats without the disruption of a full military campaign. A single death, carefully arranged, could save the lives of hundreds of soldiers and prevent the economic damage of a war. It was efficient, deniable, and deeply unsettling to anyone who suspected that they might be on the list. The psychological effect on the elite of the empire was profound. A governor who entertained thoughts of independence had to wonder if one of his own servants was a royal operative, or if his personal physician had received a separate set of instructions. Trust became a luxury that no one could afford. The most ambitious officials learned to keep their ambitions hidden, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of the unseen hand that could reach across any distance. The Assyrian assassination squads represent the logical extreme of a system built on control through fear. When terror is no longer enough to deter rebellion, targeted removal becomes the next step. And like every other aspect of Assyrian rule, it was carried out with a cold precision that left almost no trace. The only evidence we have are the letters, the gaps in the historical record, and the lingering question of how many ambitious men met their end not in battle, but in the quiet of their own homes at the hands of strangers who vanished as silently as they had come. The Assyrian king did not merely rule by divine right. He was a living god on earth. According to the official theology of the empire, the monarch was not a mortal chosen by Ashur. He was the physical embodiment of Ashur's will, a walking extension of the divine presence. This belief was not a vague metaphor. It was enforced through a system of rituals and ceremonies that demanded total submission from every person who approached him. The most visible expression of this was the practice known as proskynesis, a form of deep reverence that involved prostrating oneself fully on the ground before the king. A visitor to the palace would enter the throne room and, at a signal from the guards, lower themselves until their forehead touched the floor. They would remain there, face down, until the king acknowledged them. Rising without permission was not just a breach of etiquette, it was an act of disobedience against a god, and it carried severe consequences. Royal inscriptions record instances where officials who failed to show proper respect were stripped of their positions, beaten, or even put to death. The cult of the king extended far beyond the palace walls. In every province, statues of the ruler were placed in temples and public squares. Offerings of incense, food, and drink were made to these images as if they were actual deities. Local governors were expected to lead ceremonies that honored the king, reinforcing his divine status in the eyes of the population. The message was clear: to disobey the king was to defy the divine order of the universe, and such defiance invited not only earthly punishment but cosmic retribution. For the common person, this meant that every interaction with imperial authority carried a layer of religious fear. When a tax collector arrived, he came not just as an agent of the state but as a representative of a god. To cheat on the tribute was not merely a crime, it was a sin, and the punishment for sin could be eternal. The psychological weight of this system was immense. People learned to see the king's face on monuments and coins, to hear his name invoked in prayers, to feel his presence in every decree that reshaped their lives. He was everywhere, watching, judging, and demanding. This deification served a practical purpose as well. It made rebellion unthinkable for many subjects. How could you raise a hand against a god? The few who did try to resist found that their own followers hesitated, burdened by the fear that they were fighting something more than a mortal army. The cult of the king thus became another invisible chain binding the empire together, a chain forged from belief and enforced by the certainty that the consequences of breaking it were not merely painful but eternal. And like all chains built on fear, it held tightly until the moment the empire itself began to crack. No campaign demonstrated this power more completely than the war against Elam. In the 640s before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal turned his full military might against the ancient kingdom of Elam, a civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years in what is now southwestern Iran. The goal was not conquest in the usual sense, it was annihilation. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions describe the campaign in terms that are chilling even by Assyrian standards. He boasted that he had destroyed Elam's cities, torn down its temples, and devastated its fields. The soil itself was transformed, with accounts suggesting that salt was scattered over the farmland to prevent anything from growing again. This was a deliberate act meant to ensure that the land would not support life for generations to come. The cities of Susa and Madaktu were burned and their walls pulled down. The royal palaces were looted and then set ablaze. Statues of Elamite gods were smashed or carried away to Nineveh as trophies, the same symbolic destruction of divine power that the Assyrians had used against so many other peoples. The population faced extraordinary hardship. Many were killed during the assault, and those who survived were deported or enslaved. The Elamite language, which had been written for centuries, largely vanished from the historical record after this campaign. Ashurbanipal's scribes recorded with pride that they had turned the whole land into empty ruins where wild animals roamed. Modern historians regard this as one of the most comprehensive acts of cultural erasure in the ancient world, a systematic effort to remove every trace of Elamite identity from the map. The scale of the destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. Elam had been a major power for millennia, a rival to Babylon and Assyria itself. Within a few years, it was gone. Not defeated or absorbed, but dissolved. The very name of Elam would eventually fade from memory, surviving only in the inscriptions of its destroyers and in scattered references in later texts. Yet the campaign also reveals a profound weakness in the Assyrian approach. Eliminating an entire civilization required enormous resources, years of campaigning, and the constant attention of the king. It was a strategy that could not be repeated indefinitely, and the destruction of Elam, as thorough as it was, did not bring lasting security. Instead, it emptied a region that would later be filled by new peoples, some of whom would become enemies of Assyria in its final years. The legacy of this campaign is a stark reminder of how far an empire will go to eliminate a perceived threat, but it also raises an uncomfortable question. In the effort to erase another people, what did the Assyrians lose about themselves? The same ruthlessness that crushed Elam also poisoned life inside the palace. Behind the grand halls and the towering reliefs, the royal harem was a place of relentless ambition. Here, the queens, the lesser wives, and the concubines lived in a gilded cage, their every move watched by eunuchs who served as both guardians and spies. The stakes were enormous. A woman who bore a son to the king could see her child become the heir to the throne, lifting her own status to the highest level. But that same son made her a target. Rival mothers, jealous favorites, and ambitious eunuchs all maneuvered for influence, and the weapons they used were not swords but whispers, secrets, and carefully prepared cups of wine. The historical record preserves fragments of this hidden world. Cuneiform tablets from the royal archives at Nineveh contain letters that hint at the constant suspicion. One letter, written by a queen to her husband the king, warns him that certain officials are plotting against his life. Another tablet describes an incident where a concubine was accused of using sorcery to harm a rival. The punishments for such accusations were severe, but the accusations themselves reveal a culture where trust was a rare commodity, even among those who shared the same bed. Poison was the weapon of choice. It was silent, undetectable in many cases, and it left no obvious trace. A eunuch with access to the kitchens could slip a dose into a dish meant for a favored queen. A woman who fell ill and died slowly might be written off as a victim of the harsh climate or a sudden fever. But the women who survived learned to read the subtle signs, the unusual color of a broth, the bitter aftertaste of a cup of water. They developed their own networks of informants, servants who would taste the food first or watch for strangers near the private chambers. The eunuchs played a pivotal role in this drama. Because they could not father children, they were seen as neutral arbiters, but in reality, many aligned themselves with specific queens or factions. A eunuch who helped a favorite queen secure the succession could expect great rewards when her son took the throne. But if the plot failed, the eunuch faced a fate far worse than dismissal. The same methods of public punishment that the empire used on conquered enemies were sometimes turned inward on those who lost the internal struggle. The constant intrigue created an atmosphere where no one could relax. A queen could not be certain that her closest attendant was not reporting to a rival. A concubine might smile at a friend while knowing that the friend's son was the greatest threat to her own child's future. The palace became a mirror of the empire itself, a place where fear was the organizing principle and where trust was a luxury that could cost a life. This internal rot may have been as damaging to the empire as any external enemy. The energy that could have been spent on governing wisely was consumed by endless plots and counterplots. The kings themselves were not immune. Several Assyrian rulers died under circumstances that suggest assassination. One of the most dramatic examples is the death of Sennacherib, who was killed by his own sons while praying in a temple. The motive appears to have been a struggle over succession, and the event was recorded in both Assyrian and biblical sources. The king who had terrorized the world was brought down by the very people he trusted most. The harem intrigues remind us that the machinery of terror was not selective. It consumed everyone it touched, including its creators. The same thirst for control that drove the empire to crush foreign cities also drove the people within the palace to turn on each other. And when the empire began to falter, these internal divisions became cracks that outside forces could exploit. The question is not whether the system of fear was effective, but whether a system built on such deep suspicion can ever hold itself together when the pressure increases. The answer, it seems, was written in the silent, unmarked graves beneath the palace floors. The same ruthlessness that divided the palace was forged in the training grounds from childhood. Assyrian soldiers did not simply learn to fight. They were conditioned from their earliest years to see violence as a natural and necessary part of life. Boys born into military families were taken from their homes at a young age and placed into special camps where every aspect of their existence was shaped toward a single purpose: to become an instrument of the empire's will. The training was relentless. Days began before sunrise with long runs carrying heavy packs. Recruits practiced with bows, swords, and spears until their movements became instinct. They learned to march in formation, to build siege works, and to endure extreme weather without complaint. But the conditioning went far beyond physical preparation. The Assyrian military culture taught that mercy was a weakness that could doom an entire campaign. Instructors drilled into their students that the only good enemy was a defeated one, and that hesitation in battle could cost not only your own life but the lives of your comrades. To reinforce this lesson, training exercises sometimes involved live prisoners captured from recent campaigns. These individuals were brought before the young soldiers not as a spectacle, but as part of a harsh curriculum. Recruits were expected to practice their strokes on living targets, to overcome any natural reluctance to harm another human being. The goal was to create soldiers who could kill without hesitation, without guilt, without the slightest pause. In this warrior culture, a man who showed compassion toward an enemy was seen as unreliable, a threat to the unit's effectiveness. Stories of legendary warriors who showed no mercy were told around campfires, passed down as examples of what true strength looked like. The Assyrian army did not produce individual heroes. It produced a machine of interchangeable parts, each soldier hardened by the same brutal process, each one ready to carry out orders without question. The effect on the individual psyche was profound. A young man who entered the training camps emerged years later with a worldview that had no room for empathy toward outsiders. The enemy was not a person with a family and dreams. The enemy was an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved with the edge of a blade. This conditioning made the Assyrian army terrifyingly effective on the battlefield. Units did not break and run when the fighting grew fierce. They had been trained to push forward even when comrades fell beside them. They had been taught that retreat was a disgrace worse than death. In the annals of Assyrian kings, there are descriptions of soldiers who fought for hours without rest, who climbed ladders under a hail of arrows, who pressed on through gates that were literally on fire. The training grounds of Assyria produced a generation of warriors who seemed to have no fear, but that absence of fear came at a price. The same conditioning that made them deadly also made them incapable of seeing the humanity in those they conquered. They became tools, efficient and hollow, doing the bidding of a king who saw them as expendable. And when the empire began to crumble, there was no internal voice of conscience to question the orders, no sense that perhaps the old ways had gone too far. The warrior culture that had built Assyria also trapped it in a cycle of violence from which there was no escape. The dead were not allowed to rest in peace in the Assyrian Empire. When a city fell, the bodies of the defeated were not simply buried or left where they lay. They were collected and arranged in deliberate patterns around the conquered gates, along the roads leading into the city, and on the slopes of the siege ramps. This was not the chaotic aftermath of battle. It was a calculated act of messaging designed to speak to anyone who approached the ruins. The message was written in a language that required no translation and no scribe. It said, "This is what happens to those who resist." The Assyrian kings understood something profound about human psychology. A threat heard as a rumor can be doubted or dismissed. But a threat seen with your own eyes cannot be forgotten. So they made sure that the evidence of their power was visible, unavoidable, and permanent. The heads of the defeated were arranged in piles at the city gates, the very places where traders, travelers, and ambassadors would pass. Anyone entering or leaving that city had to walk past this display. The message was not abstract, it was physical and immediate. The practice was recorded in the royal annals with the same clinical precision used to list tribute or count prisoners. One inscription from Ashurnasirpal II describes how he built a pillar of heads in front of a conquered city. The language is matter of fact, as if describing the construction of a wall or a temple. This was not shameful or hidden. It was a source of pride, a testament to the king's effectiveness as the guardian of Assyrian order. The reliefs in the royal palaces reinforced this interpretation. In the carvings that decorated the walls of Nineveh and Nimrud, artists depicted rows of bodies arranged with an almost geometric precision. The scenes are not chaotic or wild. They are orderly, structured, and deliberate. The message for any visiting dignitary was clear. The Assyrian king did not merely defeat his enemies. He arranged their remains as a lesson for all who came after. The purpose of this display was not purely punitive, it was preventive. A city that saw the fate of its neighbor might think twice before refusing tribute or plotting rebellion. The fear generated by these displays traveled faster than any army. Word of what lay at the gates of a conquered city spread through markets and caravans, reaching regions that had not yet felt the weight of Assyrian power. In this way, the dead continued to serve the empire long after their lives had ended. They became silent soldiers in a campaign of psychological warfare that stretched across generations. For the people who lived under Assyrian rule, the sight of such displays was a constant reminder of the cost of defiance. Parents told their children stories of what they had seen, and those children grew up with a deep, instinctive understanding of the empire's reach. The fear was passed down not through written records but through lived experience, embedded in the landscape itself. Every ruined city with its silent gate became a monument not to the dead but to the living power of the king. Yet even this strategy carried an invisible weight. A system built on such displays of power requires constant renewal. The fear fades if new examples are not produced, and that means new conquests must be made, new cities must fall, new gates must be adorned. The empire became trapped in a cycle where peace was impossible, because peace would allow the memory of terror to grow distant. The very tool that held the empire together also ensured that it could never rest. And in that endless pursuit of new examples, the Assyrians were sowing the seeds of their own exhaustion. The empire that had terrorized the ancient world for centuries finally met its own reckoning in the summer of 612 before the Common Era. The city of Nineveh, the magnificent capital with its towering walls and lush gardens, was surrounded by a coalition of former subjects who had gathered their strength in secret. The Babylonians, the Medes, and various other peoples who had suffered under Assyrian rule came together with a single purpose: to end the nightmare. The siege that followed was not a quick affair. The walls of Nineveh were among the strongest ever built, rising over 100 feet in some places and protected by a moat fed by the Kosa River. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of those who knew what awaited them if they lost, but the coalition had learned from their conquerors. They used siege ramps, battering rams, and tunnels to breach the defenses. When the walls finally fell, the city was subjected to a destruction that mirrored the Assyrian campaigns in every detail. The temples were torn down, the palaces were set ablaze, and the royal library, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, was consumed by fire. The clay tablets baked hard in the heat, preserving them for future discovery, but the building itself collapsed into rubble. The Assyrian king at the time, Sin-Shar-Rishkun, is believed to have been killed in the chaos, possibly in the flames of his own palace. The nobility of the empire, the officials who had overseen the deportations and the punishments, were hunted down. The coalition forces did not show mercy because mercy had never been shown to their own people. Assyrian annals had recorded in vivid detail what happened to captured enemy leaders. Now the same fate awaited those who had once ordered such acts. The head of the Assyrian king was likely displayed at the gate of the ruined city, a grim echo of the piles of heads that had adorned so many conquered gates before. The entire city was razed so thoroughly that its location would be lost to history for over 2,000 years, known only through the writings of Greek historians who described its fall. The remnants of the Assyrian army scattered, some fleeing to Haran, where a final attempt to revive the empire was crushed a few years later. the great Assyrian civilization, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, simply ceased to exist as a political entity. Its people were absorbed into the empires that had crushed it, and its name faded from the map. The retribution was complete, but there is a deeper lesson in this collapse. A system built entirely on fear and suppression cannot generate the loyalty needed to survive a crisis. When the walls of Nineveh fell, there were no provinces rushing to defend the capital, no allied kings sending troops to break the siege. The empire had spent centuries eroding the bonds of trust and cooperation, replacing them with terror, and when terror failed, nothing was left to hold the structure together. The very methods that had made Assyria powerful also ensured that its fall would be absolute, a warning carved into the ruins of its own cities. The question that lingers is not whether the Assyrians deserved their fate, but whether the architects of any empire built on such foundations can see the pattern repeating in their own time. The silence of the cold stones of Nineveh offers no answer, only the echo of a lesson that must be learned anew by each generation. The fall of Nineveh was not the end of the Assyrian shadow. That shadow has stretched across the centuries, reappearing in unexpected places long after the last bricks of the great city turned to dust. The very name Assyria became a byword for extreme cruelty in the ancient world, and that reputation did not fade with the empire itself. Greek historians like Herodotus and later Roman writers passed down stories of Assyrian practices, often embellished and reshaped to serve their own cultural narratives. The Bible preserved the memory of Assyrian campaigns as cautionary tales of divine judgment. Over time, the historical Assyrians transformed into a symbol, an archetype of the ruthless empire that would stop at nothing to maintain control. In modern popular culture, that archetype has been especially potent. Films, video games, and novels have repeatedly drawn on the Assyrian image when they need to create a civilization that is ancient, wealthy, and morally dark. The massive palaces, the winged bulls at the gates, the reliefs depicting sieges and punishments, these visual elements have become shorthand for a certain kind of dangerous, autocratic power. Sometimes the connection is direct, a movie set in the ancient world that features Assyrian villains. More often, it is indirect, with fictional empires borrowing the aesthetic and the reputation, even if they do not use the name. The cultural shorthand works because the historical record is so stark. The annals and reliefs provide a chilling template that later storytellers can adapt without needing to exaggerate much. But the use of Assyrian cruelty in modern political propaganda carries a heavier weight. During the 20th century, various regimes and movements referenced the Assyrians as a way to frame their enemies or to justify their own actions. The term Assyrian was sometimes used to describe a particular style of repression, a refusal to compromise, a total commitment to dominance. In other contexts, nations that faced aggression compared their attackers to the ancient Assyrians, suggesting that the same ruthless logic was at work again. These comparisons are rarely accurate in historical detail, but they are powerful in emotional impact. They tap into a deep cultural memory, a fear that the machinery of terror can be rebuilt at any time. The moral lessons of the Assyrian story continue to resonate, not because the empire was unique, but because it was so extreme in its methods and so complete in its collapse. The central lesson is that a system held together by fear will eventually find its breaking point. The Assyrians invested enormous resources in projecting terror, but they did not invest equally in building genuine loyalty among their subjects. They created a framework of control that was brittle at its core, held together by the constant pressure of threat. When that pressure could no longer be maintained, the entire structure shattered. Later empires would learn from this example, sometimes by replicating Assyrian tactics, sometimes by deliberately avoiding them. The Roman Empire, for instance, also used public displays of punishment and also crushed rebellions with overwhelming force. But the Romans also developed systems of citizenship, infrastructure, and law that gave conquered peoples a stake in the empire. The Assyrians, by contrast, offered their subjects little beyond survival in exchange for obedience. The difference in approach helps explain why the Roman legacy lasted in many forms for over 1,000 years after its political fall, while the Assyrian Empire vanished so completely that its capital was lost beneath the earth. The question that lingers is not whether the Assyrian methods were effective in the short term, but whether any society that relies primarily on coercion can ever build something sustainable. The bones beneath the ruins of Nineveh suggest an answer. The people who built the great canals and raised the towering walls did not do so out of love for their king. They did so because they had no choice, and when the moment came that the king could no longer enforce his will, the entire edifice of control crumbled. The silence of the Assyrian libraries, the grass that grew over the palace floors, the desert wind that scoured the fallen stones, all of these speak to a truth that transcends any single civilization. Fear is a powerful tool, but it is not a foundation. The Assyrian Empire rose to heights that astonished the ancient world, and it fell so completely that its memory became a warning. Every generation must decide whether to learn from that warning or to repeat its cost in new forms, with new names carved into the same old stones. The dark secrets of Assyria were not random cruelty. They were a calculated system of terror designed to sustain power. From the mass deportations to the public displays of punishment, from the network of informants to the conditioning of soldiers, every element was carefully orchestrated to control millions of people across a vast territory. And yet, for all its apparent strength, that system contained a fatal flaw. Fear can compel obedience, but it cannot inspire loyalty. It can silence dissent, but it cannot build trust. When the empire faced its final crisis, the very subjects it had terrorized for centuries did not rise to defend it. They joined its enemies and watched it fall. The shadow of that empire has never fully faded. Its methods have been studied and sometimes imitated by later rulers, but they also serve as a warning that any society built on coercion alone is fragile at its core. The Assyrian story is not just a history lesson, it is a question that each generation must answer for itself. What do you think? Can fear ever be a stable foundation for rule, or does it always carry the seeds of its own destruction? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this journey through the mysteries of the past, consider subscribing for more explorations of the hidden stories that shaped our world. The lessons of history are waiting to be discovered, and the next chapter begins with you.